I recovered from amnesia, and my sister showed me years of our text conversations. Forensic analysis proved she wrote them all herself. The neurologist said 3 years of my memory were gone, probably forever. I sat in the hospital bed trying to process this while my sister Vanessa scrolled through her phone with a strange expression I couldn't read. "Don't worry, Maya," she said, turning the screen toward me. "I can help you remember everything. Look, we texted constantly. I saved every conversation." She showed me thousands of messages between us, dating back to 2021. Long conversations about my job, my apartment, my boyfriend. My entire life for 3 years I couldn't remember. The text felt wrong somehow. Too detailed, too perfectly preserved, but I was desperate for any connection to my lost past. Vanessa had flown in from Seattle the moment she heard about my skiing accident in Colorado. She'd been by my bedside every day during my 2-week coma, and now she was taking me home to her place to recover. I should have felt grateful, but something about the way she watched me read those texts made my skin crawl. Over the next week, Vanessa showed me more evidence of my forgotten life. Photos of us together at restaurants I didn't recognize, screenshots of social media posts I'd supposedly made, emails I'd apparently sent her about problems at work and relationship drama with someone named Derek, who she said had been my boyfriend for 2 years. "You worked at a marketing firm downtown?" she explained patiently, as if teaching a child. "You lived in Lincoln Park in a studio apartment. Derek was your college sweetheart, but you two broke up 6 months ago because he cheated. That's actually why you went on the ski trip, to clear your head. You invited me to come with you, remember?" I didn't remember. The doctors said retrograde amnesia could erase years, especially after severe head trauma like mine. But Vanessa had documentation of everything, a perfect record of my life, and she seemed genuinely eager to help me piece it together. Still, something nagged at me about those texts. I started reading through the conversations more carefully when Vanessa was at work. The messages were extensive, sometimes dozens of exchanges per day, spanning from January 2021 through December 2023. They detailed mundane things like what I'd eaten for lunch, complaints about my boss, discussions about Derek's family, plans for holidays. But the more I read, the stranger they felt. Every text from me was grammatically perfect. No typos, no autocorrect errors, no casual abbreviations. I'd always been a sloppy texter, using you instead of you, and rarely bothering with punctuation. These messages were different, careful and composed. When I mentioned this to Vanessa, she laughed it off. "You changed after you started your new job. You said your boss was really strict about professional communication, so you got into the habit of writing properly even in personal texts." It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't feel right. I asked Vanessa if I could contact Derek, my supposed ex-boyfriend, to see if talking to him might trigger some memories. Her face tightened almost imperceptibly, before she smiled and said Derek had moved to California after the breakup and changed his number, that he'd made it clear he didn't want contact with me anymore. She showed me a final text exchange where I had asked him to reconsider, and he'd responded coldly, telling me to stop reaching out. The conversation felt staged, too neat in its finality. I asked about my job at the marketing firm, said I wanted to call them and explain about my medical leave. Vanessa shook her head firmly. "You quit 6 months ago after the Derek situation. You told me you needed a fresh start. You'd been doing freelance work from home before the accident." Everything she said had an answer, a complete story, but none of it sparked any recognition in my brain. The doctors said that was normal, that even with evidence, lost memories might never return. My phone had been destroyed in the accident, so Vanessa had gotten me a new one with a new number. She said my old phone was completely shattered, unusable, and my previous number had been deactivated when she canceled my service to avoid roaming charges while I was in the coma. She transferred all my old photos and backed up data to the new phone, though she said some things had been corrupted in the transfer. When I opened my contacts, there were only a dozen numbers. Vanessa, our parents in Arizona, a few names I didn't recognize that Vanessa identified as work colleagues from my old job. "You weren't very social," she explained. "After Derek, you kind of withdrew from friends. It worried me, actually. That's why I made sure we texted so much, to keep you connected." Her concern seemed genuine, but I felt isolated, cut off from any way to verify the life she was describing to me. I started having dreams, not memories exactly, but fragments that didn't match Vanessa's narrative. I dreamed of living in a different apartment, a place with large windows and plants everywhere, not the studio in Lincoln Park she'd described. I dreamed of working in a bright office with an older woman who called me kiddo and brought me coffee. I dreamed of a man, but he didn't look anything like the photos Vanessa had shown me of Derek, dark-haired and serious. In my dreams, the man was blonde, laughing, spinning me around in a park. When I told Vanessa about these dreams, she frowned and said they were probably just my brain misfiring, creating false memories to fill the gaps. She suggested I not focus too much on them, that they might confuse my real recovery. But the dreams felt more real than anything in those perfect text messages. 3 weeks after leaving the hospital, I decided to do something Vanessa had told me not to do. I created a new social media account under a fake name and started searching for traces of my old life. I found my previous Instagram account, still public, and started scrolling through 3 years of posts. The photos showed me in various locations around Chicago, at restaurants, at parks, at events. But something was wrong with all of them. In every single photo, I was alone or with Vanessa. Not one picture included this Derek person who'd supposedly been my boyfriend for 2 years. Not one photo showed me with coworkers or friends. The captions were generic, brief, nothing like my actual writing style. And the locations, when I looked closely, were always the same handful of places. The same coffee shop, the same park, the same restaurant. It looked less like someone's authentic life, and more like a carefully curated facade. I called the marketing firm where Vanessa said I'd worked. It took me an hour to find their number online since she'd been vague about the company name. When I finally reached their HR department and asked about Maya Foster, my name, the representative sounded confused. "We don't have any record of a Maya Foster working here, not current and not in the past 3 years." My hands started shaking. I asked if they were sure, spelled my name carefully, gave them my birth date. "No, I'm certain. We're a small firm, only about 30 employees. I know everyone who's worked here since I started in 2019. I thanked her and hung up, my heart pounding. Why would Vanessa lie about where I worked? I searched online for the Lincoln Park address she'd given me for my supposed apartment. The building existed, but when I called the management company and asked if Maya Foster had lived there, they said they had no tenant by that name in their records. That evening, when Vanessa came home from work, I confronted her carefully, not wanting to accuse her directly but needing answers. "I've been trying to fill in some gaps," I said, keeping my voice casual. "I called the marketing firm today, but they said they don't have any record of me working there." Vanessa's expression didn't change, but I saw her grip tighten on her briefcase. "Which marketing firm did you call?" she asked. I realized I'd made a mistake. I'd only found one firm that matched her vague description, but what if it was the wrong one? Maybe I got the name wrong, I admitted. "Can you tell me exactly which company it was?" Vanessa set down her briefcase and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You know, the doctor said stress could impede your recovery. Maybe you should focus on resting rather than making phone calls. You might confuse yourself more." She didn't answer my question. I waited until Vanessa was asleep that night. Then I quietly took her laptop from the living room and brought it to my bedroom. I knew her password because she'd written it on a sticky note by her desk, probably not expecting me to snoop. I opened her computer and started searching through her files, feeling guilty but desperate for truth. What I found made my blood run cold. There was a folder labeled Maya Project containing hundreds of documents. Drafts of text messages, carefully composed to sound like they came from me. Photo editing projects where she'd inserted pictures of me into various locations around Chicago. A detailed timeline of a fabricated life, with notes about consistency and what details to emphasize. There were voice recordings of me from years ago, before my memory loss, that she'd apparently saved. And there was a document titled Contingency Plans that outlined what to do if I started questioning the narrative. I sat frozen, staring at the screen, trying to understand what I was seeing. My sister had fabricated 3 years of my life. She'd created fake text conversations, manufactured evidence, built an entire fictional history, and fed it to me while I was vulnerable and desperate for answers. But why? What possible reason could she have for such an elaborate deception? I kept reading through the files, my hands trembling. There were bank statements showing large transfers from my accounts to hers, dating back to 2021. There were legal documents, including a power of attorney that had supposedly been signed by me, giving Vanessa control over my finances. There were emails to my landlord, my actual landlord, terminating my real lease and having my belongings moved to storage. Everything pointed to a systematic theft of my life, and she'd used my amnesia as the perfect opportunity to make me believe a false history. I needed proof that would hold up beyond my word against hers. I took photos of everything on her laptop with my phone, dozens of screenshots showing the fabricated texts, the timeline, the financial transfers, the fake documents. Then I searched for information about my real life before the accident. I found emails from my actual employer, a nonprofit called Community Advocates where I'd worked as an outreach coordinator. I found lease agreements for an apartment in Wicker Park, not Lincoln Park. I found photos with a man named Julian who appeared to be my actual boyfriend, his contact information listed in an old email. I found evidence of a life that was nothing like what Vanessa had described, a life she'd systematically erased while I was unconscious and vulnerable. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone to photograph everything. I wanted to confront Vanessa immediately, but something told me to be strategic. If she'd gone to this much trouble, she wouldn't just admit the truth when caught. I needed outside help, someone who could verify what I'd found and protect me if things went wrong. At 3 a.m., I quietly packed a bag with essentials, took all the photos I'd downloaded from her laptop, and left Vanessa's apartment. I felt guilty, sneaking away like a criminal, but I was afraid of what she might do if she knew I'd discovered her deception. I took an Uber to a 24-hour diner downtown and sat in a booth with coffee I couldn't drink, trying to figure out my next move. I had evidence of fraud, forgery, and financial theft, but I had no memory of my real life to corroborate it. I was a victim who couldn't testify to her own victimhood because the crime had happened during years I couldn't remember. At 6 a.m., I called the one number I'd found in Vanessa's emails that seemed most promising. Julian Reeves, The man who appeared in multiple photos with me. The man who looked like the blonde figure from my dreams. A groggy voice answered on the fourth ring. Hello? I took a breath. This is Maya Foster. I know you don't know why I'm calling, but I was in an accident and lost 3 years of memory. I found your contact information in some old emails and I think you knew me before. Can we meet? There was a long silence. Then his voice came back, alert now, shocked. Maya? Oh my God, Maya, I've been trying to find you for months. Your sister told me you didn't want to see me, that you'd moved away and changed your number. Where are you? Are you okay? His reaction confirmed everything. Vanessa had isolated me from everyone who knew my real life. Julian met me at the diner an hour later. He was tall, blonde, exactly like the man in my dreams, and when he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. I thought I'd lost you, he said, sliding into the booth across from me. When I heard about the accident, I tried to visit you in the hospital, but your sister said you'd asked for no visitors except family. Then she told me you'd decided to move back to Seattle with her to recover, that you didn't want contact with anyone from Chicago. I tried calling, but your number was disconnected. I even hired a private investigator, but he couldn't find any trace of you. I felt a surge of rage at Vanessa for stealing even this from me. This person who clearly cared about me, who'd been searching for me. Julian pulled out his phone and started showing me photos. Real photos of us together over the past 3 years. Our first date at a Thai restaurant in 2021. A trip to Michigan we'd taken. Moving boxes from when I'd helped him move into his apartment in 2022. His face was open, honest, and looking at those photos triggered something, not full memories, but a sense of rightness, of truth. Julian filled in the gaps of my real life, and it was nothing like Vanessa's version. I'd been working at Community Advocates for 4 years, loved my job, had a tight group of friends from work who'd been devastated when I disappeared. I'd lived in a bright apartment in Wicker Park with plants covering every surface, just like in my dreams. Julian and I had been together for almost 3 years, had talked about moving in together, had been happy. What about my relationship with Vanessa? I asked. Julian's expression darkened. You didn't talk to her much. You'd told me she was controlling, that she'd always been jealous of you, that she'd borrowed money from you multiple times and never paid it back. You'd actually cut contact with her about 6 months before the accident. She kept trying to reconcile, but you said you needed space. That explained the timing. Vanessa had lost access to me, lost her source of money, and when the accident happened, she'd seen an opportunity. I showed Julian the evidence I'd found on Vanessa's laptop, the fabricated texts, the financial transfers, the fake timeline. His face went from shock to fury as he scrolled through the photos. This is fraud. This is identity theft. She stole from you while you were in a coma and then gaslit you into believing a fake life so you wouldn't question where your money went. He pulled out his phone. I'm calling my lawyer. She can't get away with this. But I stopped him, my hand on his arm. I need more than just what I found on her laptop. She could claim those files were fiction, creative writing, anything. I need forensic proof that she created those text messages, that they didn't come from me, and I need to know exactly how much she stole. Julian nodded slowly, understanding. I know someone who does digital forensics. Corporate cases, usually, but he's the best. If those texts are fake, he'll be able to prove it definitively. The forensic analyst was named David Kim, and he worked out of a small office in the Loop. Julian drove me there that morning, and I brought my phone with all the screenshots from Vanessa's computer. David was in his 40s, methodical and calm, and he listened to my story without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded thoughtfully. Text message forensics is tricky, but if your sister created these conversations herself, there will be digital fingerprints, different devices, different timestamps, different metadata. If she was texting herself from 2 phones, we can prove it. He explained that every text message contains hidden data, information about what device sent it, what network it traveled through, exact timestamps down to the millisecond. If Vanessa had been sending messages to herself from 2 phones and later presenting them as conversations between us, the metadata would show patterns that natural conversation wouldn't have. Messages sent too close together, originating from the same location, created in batches rather than organically. David asked me to sign a consent form allowing him to access my phone's data and any backup information. Then he got to work, connecting my phone to his computer and running software I didn't understand. Julian sat beside me in the small office, holding my hand while we waited. It took 3 hours. David barely spoke during that time, occasionally making notes, cross-referencing data, running additional tests. Finally, he turned to face us, his expression grim. It's worse than you thought. These text conversations are completely fabricated. Every message supposedly from you was actually sent from your sister's phone to your phone. She had possession of both devices and created entire conversations by texting back and forth between them. The metadata shows all messages were sent from the same IP address, her apartment, and many were sent in rapid succession, sometimes dozens within minutes, which is impossible for genuine conversation. She then backed up your phone to make it look like you'd been the one sending those messages all along. David pulled up a detailed report on his screen, highlighting the evidence. Look at these timestamps. On March 15th, 2023, There are 47 messages supposedly between you and your sister, spanning a 3-hour conversation about your relationship problems. But the metadata shows all 47 messages were actually created within a 12-minute window, all from the same location, all from her device to your device and back. No human conversation works like that. She was literally typing both sides of a dialogue, creating a fictional narrative. He showed me more examples, months of fake conversations, thousands of messages, all created by Vanessa alone. This is systematic fraud. She wasn't just lying to you about your past. She was manufacturing evidence to support an entirely fictional history. This would hold up in any court as proof of fraud and forgery. I felt vindicated and horrified at the same time, validated that my instincts had been right, but devastated by the extent of my sister's betrayal. Julian's lawyer was named Rachel Hoffman, and she specialized in elder abuse and exploitation cases. When Julian explained my situation, she immediately agreed to meet with us. This falls under the same legal framework, she explained in her office that afternoon. Your sister took advantage of your incapacity to steal from you and manipulate you. The fact that you're young and your incapacity was temporary doesn't change the legal principles. She committed fraud, identity theft, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable person. Rachel reviewed David Kim's forensic report, the bank statements showing transfers from my accounts, and the power of attorney documents Vanessa had forged. This is one of the most clear-cut cases I've seen. The forensic evidence alone is damning. We need to move quickly, though. If your sister realizes you've discovered the truth, she might try to hide assets or destroy evidence. I'm going to file for an emergency restraining order and freeze all accounts she has access to. Rachel worked fast. Within 24 hours, she'd filed a civil lawsuit against Vanessa for fraud, theft, and elder abuse statutes modified for exploitation of incapacitated persons. She'd also contacted the district attorney's office, providing them with David Kim's forensic report and encouraging criminal charges. The DA was interested. Financial exploitation cases with this level of premeditation and evidence rarely came across their desk so completely documented. They assigned a prosecutor named Lisa Yamamoto who called me that evening for an initial interview. I told her everything, waking up with no memories, Vanessa's seemingly helpful reconstruction of my past, my growing suspicions, the discovery of the fabricated evidence. Lisa listened carefully, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The challenge in these cases is usually proving intent and showing the victim was actually incapacitated. But you have medical records of severe amnesia, you have forensic proof of fabrication, and you have clear financial motive. Your sister stole approximately $180,000 from you over 3 years. This is serious fraud. The restraining order was served on Vanessa the next morning. Julian went with the process server to make sure she actually received it. He texted me afterward with a photo of her face when she opened the door and saw the legal documents. She looked shocked, then angry, then afraid. The order prohibited her from contacting me, from accessing any of my financial accounts, and from disposing of any assets that might be relevant to the case. It also required her to turn over my possessions that she'd put in storage, including my actual phone from before the accident. That phone, Rachel explained, would be crucial evidence. If Vanessa had used it to create the fake text conversations, it would still contain traces of that activity. Even if she'd tried to delete evidence, forensic recovery could retrieve it. Within a week, the police executed a search warrant on Vanessa's apartment, seizing her computers, phones, and any documents related to my finances or care. The evidence they found was overwhelming. Vanessa had kept meticulous records of her scheme, almost like she'd been proud of it. There were journals where she'd written about her plans, about how my amnesia was perfect timing, about how she'd always deserved my money more than I did because she'd worked harder, been more responsible. There were drafts of the fabricated texts with notes about making them sound authentic, about what details from my real life to include and what to omit. There were calculations of how much she could take before I might notice, plans for what to say if I questioned anything. The prosecutors built their case methodically. They charged Vanessa with multiple counts of fraud, forgery, identity theft, and exploitation of a disabled person. Each fake text conversation was a separate count of forgery. Each fraudulent bank transfer was a count of theft. By the time they finished, she faced over 30 felony charges. I had to give a deposition for the civil case. Hours of testimony about waking up with no memories, about trusting Vanessa, about the moment I discovered her deception. Vanessa's lawyer tried to argue that I couldn't be certain the life she'd described wasn't real since I had no actual memories to contradict her. But David Kim's forensic evidence destroyed that defense. The metadata didn't lie. The text messages were provably fake, created by one person, not genuine conversations. Rachel systematically dismantled every argument Vanessa's attorney made, showing that even if I couldn't remember my real past, the forensic evidence proved Vanessa had fabricated the false past she'd presented to me. The civil case was settled before trial. Vanessa's parents, my parents, were horrified when they learned what she'd done. They'd known I was recovering at her place but hadn't realized the extent of her lies. They offered to cover the stolen money, to make restitution, begging me not to pursue criminal charges against their daughter. I refused their offer. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about justice, about accountability, about making sure Vanessa faced real consequences for what she'd done. She hadn't just stolen from me. She'd tried to steal my entire identity, my relationships, my sense of self. She'd exploited my most vulnerable moment and tried to trap me in a fictional life that benefited her. The criminal trial was scheduled for 6 months after my discovery of the fraud. In that time, I slowly rebuilt my real life with Julian's help. I returned to my apartment in Wicker Park, which the landlord had kept in storage after Vanessa had fraudulently terminated my lease. I went back to work at Community Advocates, where my colleagues welcomed me back with tears and hugs. I reconnected with friends who'd thought I'd abandoned them. And I started therapy, working through not just the amnesia but the trauma of having been so thoroughly betrayed by someone I'd trusted completely. The trial lasted 2 weeks. I testified about my recovery, about trusting Vanessa, about the horror of discovering her deception. David Kim testified about the forensic analysis, explaining in detail how he'd proven the text messages were fabricated. Julian testified about how Vanessa had kept him away from me, how she'd lied to everyone in my life to isolate me. Rachel testified about the financial theft, the forged power of attorney, the systematic exploitation. The prosecution presented Vanessa's journals, her meticulous planning documents, her own words condemning her. Vanessa's defense was weak. Her lawyer tried to claim she'd been trying to help me, that she'd created a simplified version of my life because the real version was too complicated for someone with amnesia. But the financial transfers undermined that narrative. She hadn't been helping me. She'd been robbing me. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Vanessa guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge was scathing. He noted the premeditation, the exploitation of my disability, the psychological cruelty of the deception. "You didn't just steal money," he told Vanessa. "You tried to steal your sister's entire life, her identity, her relationships, her reality. You exploited her most vulnerable moment for personal gain and showed no remorse." He sentenced her to 12 years in prison, the maximum allowed under the charges. Vanessa cried during sentencing, finally showing emotion, but I felt nothing watching her. The person I'd trusted to help me recover had been the greatest threat to my recovery all along. After the trial, Julian and I stood outside the courthouse in the cold Chicago wind. "It's over," he said, pulling me close. "You can finally move forward." I nodded, but I knew it wasn't that simple. I still had 3 years of missing memories, still had gaps I'd never fully recover, but at least now I knew the truth. At least I had my real life back, built on genuine relationships and authentic experiences, not fabricated texts and manufactured evidence. That was enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.